All right, today we're going to dig into one of modern India's most influential and, yeah, most debated economic experiments, the Gujarat Model. For years, it was held up as this perfect blueprint for national success. But what was really going on behind the headlines?
At its core, the model was built on this incredibly simple but really powerful promise. Long before it ever became a national policy, this was the central idea. You prioritize industrial growth, you roll out the red carpet for business, and prosperity is going to follow.
And that, right there, is the big question, isn't it? Because as the source material argues, behind all those impressive growth figures lies a much more complicated story. A story of choices and of consequences. So the whole idea was really straightforward. High growth, the kind you can actually see in new factories and gleaming highways, well, that was treated as the ultimate sign of good governance. And this is where you can really see the political brilliance of this approach. Measurable economic expansion wasn't just a goal. It was used as the validation for the entire governing philosophy. The numbers themselves became the argument. Okay, so this gets us to the real heart of the issue. To understand the critique of this model, we first need to get clear on two very different and often confused concepts. So on one hand, you've got economic growth. Think of it as all about output, stuff you can easily count, right? Like the gross state domestic product, or GSDP, basically the total value of everything produced. But then, on the other side, you have human development. And that's totally different. It's about people's capabilities, their health, their education, their actual freedom to make choices. It's crucial to remember they are not the same thing. And this really gets to the core criticism laid out in the source material. It wasn't that the model failed to generate growth. It absolutely did. The argument is that it just didn't translate that new wealth into better lives for its people, at least not proportionally. So you might be asking, where do we actually see this split happening? Well, the source suggests you just have to follow the money. It's all in the state's spending priorities. So when you look at the data, it's clear that public money was overwhelmingly poured into what we call physical infrastructure. The big, visible, capital-heavy projects like highways, ports, and power plants. All the stuff that directly helps out industrial activity. And this is where the contrast becomes really stark. Investment in social infrastructure, the things that actually build up people, like public schools, healthcare, and nutrition programs, that was consistently a much lower priority in the budget. What this meant, according to the source, is that education wasn't seen as this fundamental engine for creating a skilled workforce. Instead, it was treated almost like an afterthought, something to be funded with whatever money was left over. And, as you can imagine, that had some serious long-term consequences. Okay, so what were the real-world effects of this imbalance? Well, it created a whole series of what you could call hidden costs, and they only become visible when you start looking past those big headline economic numbers and dig into the human development data. All right, first up, the number that was on every headline, an absolutely impressive GDP growth rate. For years, it was one of the highest in the country. This was the success story, right? But then you see this. And this is where it gets really interesting. The source points out that even with all that incredible wealth being generated, child malnutrition rates stayed stubbornly, troublingly high. I mean, way too high for a state that was so economically advanced. The growth just wasn't trickling down to improve the health of the most vulnerable kids. And it wasn't just nutrition either. The source points to a bunch of other areas where the social indicators just couldn't keep up with the economic boom. We're talking about high female school dropout rates, teacher availability that was often below the national average, and a growing gap between life in the cities and life in the countryside. So this brings us to the next big question. What happens when you take this state-level experiment, with all its successes and all its trade-offs, and try to make it a national blueprint after 2014? How does something like that even scale? Well, the source lays out the logic for something called jobless growth. And it goes a little something like this. First, you start with a model that really favors big, capital-intensive industries. Then, you take that model and apply it to a massive country with a gigantic labor force. What's the result? Well, you get economic expansion, sure, but you don't get nearly enough jobs for the millions of people entering the workforce every year. And this is the really crucial point here. A trade-off that might have been manageable or at least contained within a single state's economy, well, you couldn't just copy and paste that onto a nation as huge and diverse as India. The model's limitations didn't just scale up, they were amplified. Okay, so all of this brings us to a really powerful conclusion from the source. Not just about the prosperity this model created, but why its narrative was so darn compelling, even with these underlying problems. So, why did this model hold up so well against criticism? The answer is pretty simple. Its narrative was incredibly efficient. The story was just easy to tell. You can point to a brand new factory, you can drive on a new highway. It's visible, it's immediate, it feels like progress. But the successes of human development, a healthier kid, a better educated population, that's slow. It's way less visible, and it's a heck of a lot harder to turn into a catchy political slogan. And that, right there, is the ultimate takeaway from this analysis. The argument is that when you chase economic growth as if it's the only thing that matters, without making an equal investment in your own people, well, the prosperity you build is fragile. It looks good on the surface, but it's just not built to last. And so that leaves us all with a pretty fundamental question. And it's not just for India, it's for any developing nation out there. How do you find the right balance? How do you meet that urgent, undeniable demand for jobs and growth today without sacrificing the long-term potential and well-being of your people for tomorrow?